2005. And I've worked as a consultant. I've worked as an ISV partner doing product development. I've written a bazillion solutions, custom solutions, functional specs. This is kind of what I've learned from the session, but from my years. And before we get started, there's been a lot of cats here. So this is my dog, Heston. I've just had him for 2 months. I really miss him. But anyway, this is my boy. So today we're going to talk about what's a functional spec. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite sayings, Yanya, and the tools you might use, and then the components in a functional spec that we use to get all the way to deployment. And you'll notice there's some things here you wouldn't expect, like QA, deployment steps, admin notes, things like that. So first of all, what's a functional spec? Okay, so it's not a technical spec. I'm not defining class names. I'm not deciding on programming infrastructure. But I am defining what I expect to see, and it might go down all the way down to the field level. And I might make recommendations on where I want the solution to be extensible. It's a detail of the functionality that's to be built. I consider it a working document. It's not actually done until we've gone live, because some of the last steps are QA and administrative notes. And at the end, it serves as documentation, which a lot of times we don't have. So you've built something, especially if you're a consultant, or you've built something in-house and the team has shifted and nobody remembers what was built and how it works. Well, you have this functional spec to reference back and say, this is what it does, this is why we built it, this is how it works. So at this point we go, well, what about Agile? You know, how does Agile fit into writing a traditional functional spec, right? So in the Agile world, we might have an epic, and then it's really, we go through user stories and iterations, and we have sprints. And it works pretty well if you have domain expertise and you have a team that's available for lots of meetings and lots of stand-ups. The problem I typically see with this methodology is the person who's written the epic or the user story is usually a business owner. They don't go into enough detail, and it's left for the developers to figure out what they want, and oftentimes they just code the wrong thing. So what's missing here, this can be successful if you have a domain expert that's translating that business owner case to the sprint format, which can work. This is more traditional top to bottom, which is where I usually live, right? I'm going to get business requirements, and I'm going to design a solution. I'm going to collaborate with the dev team. I'm going to make sure my business owners agree on what we're building. We're going to do QA, UAT, and we're going to deploy it. So if I was going to fit this into, I'm working with an organization, say, that does do Agile development, I would recommend that you would review the spec, the whole initial draft, with development, because you want to tease out from them if there's any big functional pieces that they need to build that you're unaware of. They might need to refactor code. They might need to write an assignment engine. You know, there might be a piece that's going to span several sprints because it's an infrastructure piece that's needed. And then if it's going to span multiple sprints, you want to prioritize those development infrastructure pieces and then pull out pieces that you can send over to UAT. For example, you might want to have, let's build the fields in the first sprint, because I'm going to populate it with dummy data, and I'm going to present these dummy reports to my business owner to make sure that they agree that this is how they want to report on the data, right? And then be sure that if you are spanning sprints, that you've built a section out in your document on what goes into each sprint, how you're going to build it, so that there might be QA, right, for each section. I'm not used to having a fancy clicky thing. So this is, Yanya comes from Tobias Leenart. He's actually from Belgium. He gives a wonderful talk. And I love this. Yanya stands for you are not your audience. And you want to keep this in mind when you're writing a functional spec, because you're going to have a lot of different people that are going to be consuming and collaborating on the functional spec. So you have your business owner, and your business owner may or may not be in Salesforce altogether. They might also help you be part of the UAT team. They might decide that they're QAing. You have to kind of understand who they are and what they understand. You've got your developer that may or may not understand the whole org. They might be an outside consulting firm. They might be somebody who really knows what's going on in the org and the implications. You have your QA person. Again, if they're part of a consulting team, they may not know how to create an opportunity in this org. What are the base requirements? And you might have completely separate users, say a sales team that's going to go through the process and agree that they like the way it works. And then, of course, you have the admin who's in charge of owning the application when they're done, and they need to understand it, and they need to understand any implications of changing things in the org and how they might break things. So I mentioned earlier that it's a collaborative effort. And these are some of the tools I like to think about. Depending on what your role is, if you're working in-house and you're writing a lot of solution designs, or if you're a consultant, you might want to have a template. There might be typical things that you're repeating over and over again, like how to create an opportunity, make sure these fields are populated, always create it off of a contact, so there's a contact role. There might be things that you're repeating. And if you work for a consulting company, of course, they're going to want to look professional, so they're going to have a template too. And we're going to go through the components. So you grab your template, or you start from scratch, and you fill in the details. I like this document to be collaborative. I like Google Docs, Box, Notes. There might be other collaborative editing things. What you don't want is documents flying around in email, right? You want to make sure that people can write questions and comment on a document then and there, so that you're answering questions and you're moving it along. And you're going to also want to work with diagrams. So I've been using Glyphy lately, but there's lots of good diagramming tools. Let me get a sip. I forgot to start my timer, so I'm 7 minutes in. Okay. Diagrams are really important to give you a visual. You're going to find it's going to really help your functional spec a lot. And then, of course, part of what you're doing, because one of your audience members is developers, is you're going to use the object reference, so that when you're talking about what they're updating, you're actually referencing it correctly by the correct object name, the correct field name, so that there's no confusion about what they're supposed to be updating. My goal is to make sure that it works correctly the first time, right? And if it doesn't, then you can point to a document and say, you didn't build it the way it says, right? So the first section in your functional spec is your business overview. And here, you have these two audiences. We have the business owner and we have the developer, right? So what we're doing for the business owner is we're stating the problem and we're stating what the solution is going to be. So we're showing them that we understand what their issue is and this is how we're going to solve it. And then we're giving context to the developer so that they're not working in a vacuum. If you're working with a good developer, they're going to think critically about what your solution is, and they're going to push back, or they're going to recommend an improvement, right? And so by inviting them to read the whole document and understand the context of what they're building, you're empowering them to be part of the team. This might be new for them. They may never have had the chance to do this. So even during the document review, have that conversation. Highlight. You'll see as we go through this, you're going to highlight. Please put in here what you build. What's your recommendation for this, right? That way you're going to get a better solution with more brains. So I always ask them to read the whole thing. Sometimes that's a battle, right? They don't really want to, but I do call out that they should read the whole thing. So this is an example of a business overview. For the project we're going to go over today, it's very simplified. But in order to support your Dreaming Inc. sales process, key stakeholders must be defined before an opportunity stage can progress. Stakeholders are to be added as opportunity contact roles and given the appropriate label. Sales reps are not complying with this requirement because it involves more clicks. Oh no! And so we're going to make them identify stakeholders based on the opportunity stage they want to set by presenting them with a validation alert. The rep will have to revert the stage and add the stakeholder. Then the rep can update the stage. So I've bolded stakeholders and alert because these are business concepts that we want to explain later to the developer. What do we mean by stakeholders? What do we mean by alert? And it probably wouldn't be bolded in the actual document, but for the purposes of this discussion. Then the next section you're going to have is the development overview. And this is where you're going to talk about where the developer is going to build the solution. What sandbox should they use? Do they need to install any packages? Does there need to be a certain data there before they can start building? Do they need to wait till the sandbox is refreshed, right? We're going to talk about the general approach to your solution. This is going to be a trigger, or this is going to be a batch. And the reason you're talking about this, and you might have a conversation with them about it, is because you might know that this doesn't need to be an immediate update, and it can just be handled with a batch. So take the burden off of them of writing a trigger, right? And you're going to talk about extensibility that's going to be built into the solution, where you might need to edit things. And you're also going to talk about core concepts, like what is a stakeholder, what do we mean by alert, and also for contractors, do this in a way that's not too insulting. I usually make something like, I'm putting this in here because I kind of have to, but you know best practices, don't you? But I want it in writing, okay? One trigger. Don't write another trigger. Don't put code in your trigger. It has to be bulk save. I want your unit tests to actually test things. Let's see, this thing's working. Okay, so this would be an example of a development overview. Again, sometimes in real life it could be a lot longer, but you know, we're going to build the code in the pre-staging sandbox, and the ABC app has to be installed and configured. Code will be written as an opportunity trigger when the opportunity stage is changed before update. Please do not write the code in the trigger. Use the existing opportunity trigger called opportunity trigger to call the new classes that you write. And code must be bulk safe, commented, had 95% code coverage. I almost edited that to 100. Now that I did Rad Women and learned how to code, I think they can probably reach 100. Why not have them explain why they can't? And then unit tests should be run real tests. So we would expect to see system assert statements within the unit tests. And then I'm going to explain key concepts to them, right? I'm going to say a stakeholder. This is the evaluation of the opportunity contact role. I'm using the object reference to reference the actual object, not the user-friendly language, because this is my developer section. And they're related to the opportunity and the value in the role field. And each opportunity stage, opportunity.stage name, will require one or more opportunity contact role records that will be referenced in custom meta type or custom setting, right? And then now I'm explaining to them the fact that the same contact can be listed multiple times as an opportunity contact role with different role names, right? It's okay if Joe is the primary stakeholder and the decision maker and the purchaser, right? That we don't care about that. We're actually looking at the unique role name. And I'm asking them how they want to approach the extensibility. Do you want to use a custom setting? Do you want to use custom metadata? You know, and then I want them to come back and update this document with what they created so that I can reference it later in QA scenarios. I can reference it later in my deployment list. And I'm going to also explain the alert concept to them. You know, I want it to be before they save the stage. It can be by the stage name, or it can be a pop-up. You know, I want the error to be dynamic. And what is your recommendation for the best classic or lightning experience? Because they might be able to tell me that there's a huge cost to do an in-page, you know, alert validation message versus a pop-up. And I want to know that. So I'm leaving this open because I don't really care. But if they say a pop-up is going to be way harder, I can go back to my business owner and say, hey, you know, this is going to take a lot more time to do. Are you OK with just an in-page validation error? So again, I'm bringing them into the collaboration with me. And then this is a very, very high-level diagram. There's no details in here. I'm going to usually write this while I'm still in my discovery with my business owner. So we've got a visual, right? It's an existing opportunity. This change of stage, is the stage changed? Nope, we're done. Yes. Does it have the right stakeholders? No. Go ahead and give me an error, right? And this is because business owners have you know, when I'm writing these functional specs, it twists my brain. It's painful, right? You're following complicated logic. My business owner is going to be even more challenged with that. And I found that the minute I give them a visual, I've made it easier for them. So I want this in the beginning. And it might include pre-processes. It might include other things here that aren't part of the code, just again to give context of what the flow is. So the next thing I want to think about is I want to build extensibility into my solution, right? I want to have configuration rather than recoding. So I want to think about anything that might change. One of the ways to do that is metadata or custom settings. I might want to have an on and off switch, and I know that like for Apex developers, it's actually best practice in Apex classes to reference a custom metadata or a custom setting to be able to turn off your triggers in your classes, but a lot of people don't use that best practice. But I read about it in Dan's Advanced Apex Programming book, and I was like, yeah. I like on and off switches on things. I might want to not just have general criteria, but I might have one-offs. So I might have a checkbox that also makes my record eligible because I want my, my business owner might have, I want this opportunity processed too, and it's just kind of an edge condition. And I might want an audit field. So a lot of times when you're building code, especially let's say you're running a batch and you want to know if the batch evaluated an opportunity, and even if it didn't update anything, I want to know that the evaluation actually ran on it. I might have the code set an audit field last evaluated or something like that. So think about like when you're going to have to troubleshoot, do you want to have any kind of way to audit the fact that the code ran? So this would be my extensibility example. Which opportunities is this going to run on? Well, it'll run on if the type is new business, and we're also going to have a formula field called require stakeholder checkbox is true, and my admin's going to maintain this formula. So if the criteria changes, my admin will just have it be true based on the criteria changing. And I'm going to have some users that we're going to not be subject to this validation for stakeholders. My admins and finance users can change opportunity stages without requiring adding contact roles. And maybe there's integration users. And then I'm going to ask them, should we go with a user record checkbox? Do we want to do some configuration based on role or profile? I'm going to ask the admin what do they think is the best thing. In this particular design, it was a small org, so we decided on a user checkbox. So we're going to talk about efficiency, but I was just in this wonderful section called Invocable Methods, the Musical. So it made me change my slide. It was a wonderful session. And he was talking about one of the ways you can build extensibility is actually let the admin own a process and then have that process invoke the method that does the complicated stuff. And I hadn't mentioned that here. You can see my messaging is like, think about the order of execution and how workflows run after triggers, they fire before and after triggers again. And this is just like a big mess. So in fact, don't just use declarative logic because you can. Don't say, well, these 3 things I can do in workflow and this thing can do in Apex. Control it, build it all in Apex. And in fact, if you have other stuff going on that object already in different workflows, consider consolidating everything together, because I don't know about you, but the CPU error issue, especially when you get into more complicated org, it's really painful. So this is a time this would be like fall under refactoring. But I love this. It's not bulk safe, but if you have a use case, which we do, maybe users are they going to update more than 200 opportunity stages at a time? Do they even have the UI to do it? Probably not. So we could do something like this for this particular solution, where we're controlling the conditions of firing in a process, and then we're just calling the code. I have to point here when I'm doing that. So this is where I'm going to have more of a conversation about what I need from them. So I'm going to say, this is a trigger because I want it to fire immediately. I want that validation rule to be there. And I want you to consider any limits. In our case, it's going to be a trigger, but we're going to want to think about what else is going on in the org on that object at the time when we decide it's a trigger. Is it going to be batch? Is it going to be asynchronous? Is a future call sufficient? What's our general approach? And this is where, if you're a consultant coming in, you want to talk to the sysadmin about what else is going on. I mean, you can poke around too, but you don't want to set yourself up to, just essentially die a horrible death when it goes live. You might have, it might be batch, you might have to specify if there's multiple records we're processing, is there an order in which we process them, oldest to newest, based on what field, last modified date, created date. And some of these things, such as, sort order, might be something that I'm going to repeat in lots of different places in my functional spec. So that's something they can encapsulate in a function, a sorting function, and be more efficient with their code. And then if it's a batch, I'm always going to ask for a dev console method. I want to be able to run my code right away with one or more records, because first of all, it's going to let me do one-offs, and also without having to wait for the batch to run. And also, especially if I'm doing a batch-based solution, this speeds up my QA. So I can set up opportunities, I can run them through, see if it worked, I don't have to wait for the batch to fire. Another choice is also to have another code snippet that fires the batch off, right? So this would be an example. Code should be written as an opportunity trigger when the opportunity stage is changed before update. Use the existing opportunity trigger to call the class. Please indicate the class name and test classes below. Right? And then I'm going to talk about the records that we're going to update. So we kind of talked about it at a high level before, but because this is in the functional specification, we're going to think through what is subject to this code, what are the exceptions, are we building the on and off switch? And we're going to be careful with our language, because when you write, this triggers when so-and-so happens, they're thinking trigger, right? These are the exceptions, they're thinking apex exceptions. So we just want to think about where we might be creating confusion in the language we use. In fact, Dan, a long time ago, I used to say, it needs to trigger at this time, and he would say, it's not a trigger, Rowan. And I would go, okay. So this is a little bit of a messy slide, because the and or, I don't think I would normally write it that way, but we're all technical. So this is what I'm going to write for them. I'm going to say, these records are subject to this code if the opportunity type, again, dot notation, is referenced in the custom metadata or custom setting. Again, indicate what you wrote, or I'm going to pull it down when they wrote it down. I'm going to add it in here so it's complete. That's why this isn't done till we're done. And this is going to be my checkbox field if it's true, and also the running user bypass. We decided on a user field, so the stakeholder bypass field on the user record is false. I really probably should have done dot notation here for the running user.
So Roan, in this situation, you're actually, in a way, you're helping out the technical guy behind the scene, and you're giving them as much information as is possible, but you're leaving it open to him to actually add in if you don't have it yourself.
Yeah.
So because you know that you have the functional and the technical, but it's possible the same person will validate your functional and then create your technical afterwards.
I usually have a different person at the business case. This is the developer is rarely going to say we need this new feature. The developer is going to execute on this, right?
Just going to execute, so
right.
You're filling in to make sure.
I'm filling it in later on because I want this document to be complete. I don't want to blank here. I want to say the opportunity type is referenced in the custom metadata, and then I'll put the name of the custom metadata, so that when we're going later and we're looking, we're a year later, and they're going, well, what is it doing? And I'll go, well, look at this custom metadata. This is where it's configured.
So you control it from that perspective,
yeah.
By giving as much as possible in order that there's no discrepancy at a later point.
So I know that I don't know how many of you are on the Slack channel, but I really did have a project that I wasn't running. Oftentimes I come into projects. And I was sitting in with a very big consulting company working with a client who wasn't gathering. They didn't track their requirements anyway, so nothing worked. And they did two things. First of all, they built a duplicate field because they didn't feel comfortable using the one we specified. And secondly, they couldn't present anything to us about what they were coding to. So I actually said in the meeting, are you like coding to sticky notes? Like, what are you coding to? You have to have something you're referencing, and they were very offended. And then I had to be quiet because I didn't want to upset the client. But they got fired shortly after that. And now another big company is doing a much better job. So I tend to be very controlling here because I've looked to see, is there an existing field we can use already? I don't want to create new fields. The developer, especially if they're a third party, they're not going to look. They're not going to take the time. They just want to get it done, right? So that's not true for all consulting firms. But if they're getting a functional spec, they're getting a handoff of something. They haven't done all the discovery. They're oftentimes not paid to do it. So I guess I'm very controlling, but I get it working the first time or am able to, yeah?
What do you do when I come in as a consultant and there were two consultancies before and both of them made separate fields for the same thing?
Well, we would, I mean, well, so I wasn't dealing with those people, right? If this had been my project, they would have had this document. Like, I was, yeah, this is what we're building. Do you have places, well, I'll talk to you a bit about where I want them to partner with me and recommend improvements. But I'm also going to present them as much information as I can so I can control the process. So this is, we're talking now, again, separate section for the developer where I'm talking about what are extensibility solutions. This is what we're going to build, right? We're going to do custom setting or custom metadata. And sometimes I'll actually define the fields. If I don't build them, I'm going to define them. I'm going to give them the label, the API name I want, the description and help text, because I want description and help text. I want user-friendly names, not really good developer names, but they're not good for my end user who's customizing things. So again, I'm going to be really controlling here. And it's going to look like this, okay? So we're going to have a custom metadata or type or custom setting called eligible opportunities. And there'd be more fields on this, but my first field is, it's going to have a label, it's going to be default, but don't code to this, don't reference this label if it's a custom setting, because it's limited to 40 characters. Unless I know for sure there's only ever going to be less than 40 characters, I just ignore that field. But I'm going to create another field, it's going to be called opportunity type, and I'm going to give them everything I want here, and this is my initial value, and I'm going to say, please list what you built, right? And there, I'm going to also have another custom setting or custom metadata type called opportunity stakeholders, right? And I'm going to have a label called stage name. And again, I'm going to define it, and I'm going to have the requirement that they not allow duplicates of the stage name in here.
And just please list what was built.
I'm going to say, like, we built a custom metadata type,
okay.
right?
So the coding, so account dot, or the full length is what you expect.
I'm expecting to hear from that. What I'm expecting to know is, was it a custom setting or custom metadata type? What did you build?
Oh, okay.
You know, really, what did you decide to do would be best? Because I'm not a developer, right? Did you decide on an invocable method after we talked about it? And this is going to be the name of the method, and this is this is the label you're going to see, and this is the API name, so I can add it into my change set. And I'm going to show them the final data that we're going to be using. So if I've built, yeah?
There's all detail in your spec. Isn't there a risk that you have to keep updating this multiple times during an agile process, and that sometimes you maybe forget things or they build something which is not in your document?
So if they built something not in my document, that's on them, right? This is the way that I cover my, do we say that here? Cover my ass.
Yes.
Okay, right? Hey, you didn't build what we said you were going to build, right? And yes, I'm working on this as they're changing things. And you're going to see we're actually going to get to QA in this document, with a lot of times people don't think QA is part of a functional spec, but writing out QA scenarios is the way that I give my first run of insurance that I haven't missed anything. But this is going to be my final data. And if this was a more complicated spec, I might say a minimum of 2 are required for each stage, right? Like it might not be every single one. But this is just a simple example. But if I've said it's going to be, if they say it's going to be a custom setting, but we're not going to build for 2 weeks, I'll go, okay, great. I would build the custom setting and I would populate it in the sandbox for them and be ready to go, right? It speeds it up. Now we're getting into the description, which is really like the meat of if, then, else stuff, right? So you might have, depending on your complexity of whatever you're building, you might have more than one sequence. Like you might have a clone opportunity sequence and a this sequence and a that sequence. And they might each have flowcharts, or you might have a giant flowchart, and then you're drilling into details of each section because they're kind of their own logic tree. And we're going to have our flowchart numbered. We're going to use labels and API names. We're going to identify dynamic elements and tiebreaker rules, which again might be repeated. So our simple diagram has turned into a diagram that's numbered now. And we have more decision trees. You know, is the opportunity eligible? Has the stage changed? Is the user exempt from validation rules? Now, this order in which it's evaluated might not be the most efficient. right? So this is where the developer might say, it's actually more efficient for me to first just see if the user is even subject to this code, and then I'll go ahead. A lot of times they don't necessarily tell me if they've made that change. It would be great if they did. But again, I'm going to say that to them. I'm saying when we're reading this, I'm going to say, hey, this might not be the best order to do this in, so if you decide to change around, let me know. I'll adjust the diagram. And the actual description is going to look like this, right? An opportunity is updated. You know, it matches the global setting. I'll put the name of the global setting here. I'll have yes and no's, and we're just going to kind of move through the whole thing for the section, right? Okay. And, okay, so now we come to QA. Like I said earlier, I do include QA in my functional specifications because it helps me think through what I've missed. And oftentimes I'll actually have to go back to the business owner and say, hey, I thought about an end condition, what do you think about this? And then I'll have to revise. I have to think about my audience in my QA because I have a lot of different users, and some might be part of this process and some might be not. And I'm going to have, that's going to manage the level of detail I go into. And I have to also, I always, even though I'm not part of the QA team, I always do a run myself, because then I see if I've missed anything, you know. I didn't think about that. Oh, we need a scenario for that. And then, you know, I go back and say, I missed this. I didn't think about it. I'd rather find my mistakes before the, you know, the end user does. So if we think about it, I'm going to go into like, how do you actually test this functionality? I might describe how to use the code snippet they wrote for me in the developer console. I have to think about my audience. Do they even have access to the developer console? Have they ever used it before? Is this appropriate for the audience? I'm going to do one round myself to test. So I'm also going to have to think about my audience in here in terms of how I end up writing the functional spec. You know, do they know how to create an opportunity? So I've worked with, I remember one time, it was actually an opportunity trigger, and the developer built the whole code and never tested their code. They had actually never created an opportunity in the Salesforce UI before. They had always done it programmatically. I want them to test their code, right? At least run through it once before you hand it off to me. So do they know how to create an opportunity? You know, maybe there's, you know, some fields that are required to create an opportunity. Maybe this particular org, you have to create opportunities off of a custom object, and you have to make sure these fields are populated ahead of time. Do they know how to create an opportunity contact role? You know, do we need to test as a specific running user? And do they know how to log in as a running user, to test as a running user? And I'm going to also, in the QA, I'm going to include API names. And the reason for that is because if I hit a QA scenario that doesn't work, I'm going to actually go back to that with the developer, and we're going to read through it, and they're going to go, oh, I missed this, or oh, I should add some unit tests for this, right? And then we built extensibility. So I'm going to have a section for the QA people in the QA section. So even though we defined what it is above, we're back here, QA people, right? We're going to talk about the custom settings, how you get to them, any things you might need to alter for testing. You know, in this case, I would say make sure that in your testing you're going through every single one of these stages. And I don't have stage 1 in here. I'm not firing on create. And I don't have close lost, because I'm not firing on close lost. And so QA scenarios, in my mind, what you want to do is you're trying to break the application, right? Because again, you want to break it before it goes live. So you should number your test scenarios so that you can reference them. It's easy to reference them, and you're not like, which one was that? And you should have positive and negative tests. And I typically, what I'm doing is I'm starting with a brain dump, or I'm building a brain dump section. What I usually have, to be honest, is a ignore this part in the Google Doc, and then I'm just making bullets of things I want to make sure that test. And I'm doing that while I'm building flowcharts. I'm doing that while I'm thinking about things. And I'm going to include how the data gets set up. So in my data setup section, I might have said, This is how you create a new opportunity. This is how you update an opportunity. Like if you're going to update to qualified, make sure you've got an amount field populated. These things are going to be required. So there might be some other data that they'll reference in the data setup section. Actions the user needs to take, expected outcome and results. So sometimes your QA section is longer than your functional spec. I hate writing QA scenarios, but it really does help you come up with a better solution design. See. So this is an example of my brain dump for this project. So it shouldn't fire for new opportunities. So let's create one in the prospecting stage, create one as closed one. So even if it's created as closed one, it's not firing, right? It shouldn't fire for an ineligible opportunity. So create one that's not new business, make sure the extra checkbox isn't set. It shouldn't fire for a bypassed user. It shouldn't fire on an opportunity update without a stage change. And it should fire on opportunity stage update if the opportunity contact role is missing. So we're doing positive and negative testing. So I'm really trying to break it. I'm trying to make sure, well, is it just going to fire if I just make any old update? I mean, I've seen all kinds of things. You want to do things that you're not expecting because you really do want to find it first. So this is a simple test, right? This is a positive test for updating the stage of qualification. So we're going to create an opportunity, stage types, new business, stages prospecting, amounts $100 and save. And I really should have had here run as or don't be an excluded user, right?
Run a specific profile, you mean? Or run as a specific
Yeah, I could be running as a specific user, exactly. Like that's missing. I should fix that in the deck. See, you always find something. And then after that, I'm going to update the stage of qualification and save. So I'm expecting this validation error. Stage qualification requires a business user contact. And then I'm going to write my actual results, so it'll be fail or pass. And this might go to a whole QA team. But my initial run through, I'm in the Google Doc, and I'm going pass, 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 pass. I'm just doing a quick, I want to make sanity check. Did someone have a question? No? Okay. Okay. So while we're building this thing out and I'm building fields and I'm, all that stuff, I've been tracking everything I've built down in a section called deployment steps. Why is that going there? Because I'm the one who knows right now everything that's part of this project, right? And while a sysadmin might be deploying it or building my change set out for me, or I might be building it, I want to make sure that I haven't lost track of any single thing. And while I'm doing the solution design, I'm also thinking about pre-step stuff. Like, for example, we need to make sure that all of our opportunities actually have a value in the type field. Otherwise, some of these opportunities, we would want them to validate, they won't. We might need to have sales go through and add contact roles for certain opportunities. We might have to do a sales training. Let's think about the timing for that. So we want to think about what has to happen pre-deployment. I want to have everything that we've built and any other steps, adjust page layouts. We want some reports to monitor if there's errors, what is our field visibility is going to be. Especially like, even if this is my org and I'm deploying it, I want to track everything down ahead of time so I don't forget, because it can be a lot. And I don't know what other tools you guys use for deployments, but this is kind of my way of doing it. And then I'm going to think about post-deployment steps. So if we've written a batch, we would need to schedule it. I don't want to forget, right? And then,
we're nearly there.
okay, so this is the last part of the document. It's admin notes. So the admin's going to inherit this, going to own it. I want them to think about what do they need to keep in mind. So for example, if they change opportunity stages, they're going to have to change all their custom settings and configurations. If they decide they want change opportunity contact rules, if they change their business process, they add new users, they might need to set the user bypass field. They want to know about the formula. So I want to make sure there's a handoff to them, mostly because if I don't do this handoff, even though they might be a really big part of this project, if I don't do this handoff, then this is another cover your ass thing, right? I've explained to you the implications of this code. Now you're going to maintain it. You have clear instructions on how to do it. And if they leave, there's somebody else that can read it later. And, oops. Let's go back to this. Last slide is just, I just had some resources here.
We'll probably share that with everybody.
I had to give you the newest one that has a picture of my dog. Anyway, order of execution. This is really interesting if you haven't dug into this already, how we can get into recursion issues. That's Glyphy, and this is my favorite go-to. A lot of times, even developers don't realize that something that looks like a pick list is actually a separate object. Like the opportunity stage field is an object, right? The campaign member status field, an object, right? So that's why we want to educate them and be really clear about what we're referencing.
Recent changes like email, for example. It's
Yeah.
quite interesting.
Yeah.
I know that in terms of time, but I think it's good if we take 5 minutes extra for any questions. I think is that okay with you? So go for it.
Thank you for sharing this. So this is everything when everything goes good. What do you do about errors? So in the story, do you mention like, okay, we are testing and we are everything, but errors do happen. And sometimes what I'm also looking for a spec when I'm working as a developer is also, okay, if this error comes, how should I notify, what should I say to the user? And then the next part is if the error happened, do you go back to your spec and see what did you miss out on?
Are you talking about catching like system exceptions?
Any kind of error. It can be sometimes like the user doesn't know what kind of like postcodes in UK are different. So also those kinds of errors. It can be as small as that. And the UK postcodes are with alphanumeric.
Great, so this is a conversation I would have with you right now as a developer. I would say, well, what kind of errors are you expecting? Well, what do you recommend? Well, that doesn't apply to this case in particular because they're just simply going to change the stage back, save any changes they have, add their contact rules and proceed, but maybe there'd be some other, if it's a validation rule error, well, they're going to also see that in the UI. So, but we would have that. I would be very, very happy to work with a developer that would actually ask me those questions because I'm not a developer, right? Yet.
Any other questions from the group?
Yeah?
Sure.
What is the moment in the development lifecycle that you start with this document?
I've had a conversation with the business owner, and I've taken kind of high-level requirements from them, and I'm starting there. And I'm hopefully diagramming, so I'm having a couple talks with them before it ever goes to code, right? I'm thinking about the exceptions. I'm having a second, more in-depth conversation with them. Sometimes they go, I don't know, we're going to have to talk about that, and I'll hear back from them in a week. But I'm trying to capture it as soon as I know there's going to be a custom project.
That's like epic level that comes with epic on the roadmap. That would be the trigger for you to start talking about this topic.
So I would have, I don't work with a lot of teams that do agile. I'm mostly old school, so I'm just going to be honest about that. And what I'll see is my business owner will talk, oh, we want this, and the developer will say, well, create a user story. So they'll create a really high level one, and then they'll reference the functional spec when it's ready. And then we'll have a meeting with the developers and we'll decide on the strategy. But they'll get it queued up, because it might be 4 months till they can get to it if it's a really big, busy org. And that gives us plenty of time to build out the functional requirements and kind of think about how it fits into the sprints.
Yeah.
Was there one over? Yeah?
Thank you for this presentation. So obviously after this, I want my customer to have this kind of documentation everywhere. The problem is they don't have time. So
You don't have time.
they don't have the money for it, let's say. So the approach would be like, for now on, maybe we agree with the customer that for now on, for the new features, we are going to roll out this kind of stuff. Instead of saying that we are going to stop developing the features and try to document all the org, what will be the best approach?
I would just start moving onwards. If they have budget to document what they have, great. If you're coming across things, you're writing a functional spec and it's interfacing with an existing process, you can do something kind of high level to touch on it, but it's not on you necessarily to document all of it. You do all of these things anyway, right? You QA your code anyway. You get your business requirements anyway. This is just a matter of keeping it in one place so everybody can be aligned.
And Sergey, last question.
I actually have two.
Oh,
Fine. First question, would you use the approach to
Would I use what?
Your approach to deal with technical debt?
Well, we did talk about possibly refactoring code and, removing extra workflow. I mean, I walked into an org last week that had 7 or 9 workflows on the lead object, and they all allowed reevaluation. So we might have just gotten rid of all of those and put it into an Apex class. So that is a place where you can reduce it.
And second question, would you keep a versioning of your document because it's probably changes during the timeline?
No. So for one deployment, I might, if I'm really revising it, I might, if there's something new I'm adding, I might put red text, and I'll make sure I'll call out to the developer. This is something extra we added, but they haven't started building yet, right? But after it's done and deployed, and we're now doing another version of it, or we're adding a new feature, then I'm going to clone the document and say V2, and I'm going to highlight what's different, right? But I try to stay in one document for the initial build. It's just the way I do it. It's not like the only way to do it.
No, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.